Thank you, Rabbi Elton, for that lovely introduction. And you already had a hint of the highlights because we will be visiting the three places that Rabbi Elton mentioned: the British Library, Cambridge, and the John Rylands Library in Manchester, in addition to the fourth major collection, the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Two program notes for this evening. First, when you came in, and there may still be some flyers left, you may have seen a flyer for my recently published book, How the Bible is Written. Several people have been asking me about this. The publisher sent me a copy all the way from Boston, Massachusetts to Sydney, Australia, covering all sorts of land and sea to get here. And so I have one copy here, and if anyone would like to peruse it, it'll be on display at the table at the end, so you can have a look at that. And it's a book all about, as the subject says, the way the Bible uses language, the biblical authors use language for the creation of literature. So it's a nice tome, and I hope you agree with me, it looks beautiful. Okay, thank you to my publisher for the great artwork and the production of this beautiful book, of which I am most proud. Okay, thank you. That's program note number one. Program note number two, if you've been here on prior lectures that I have delivered, I just wanted to do a little warning and to tell you that tonight may be a little bit longer than the others. I'm free till 1 or 2 in the morning, so no matter how late we go. But the wealth of material in England is so remarkable that it was difficult for me to just cut and cut and cut. This has to be shown, this has to be seen. So with that as my introduction, let's do it. Okay. Now, the Jews in England, Jewish history in England actually begins immediately, or very shortly after 1066. So when William the Conqueror crossed the English Channel from Normandy and defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, we introduced a new stage in British history called the Norman period, which is then followed by the Angevin period and the early Plantagenet period. So between the years 1066 and 1290 is what we're looking at here. One of the first things that William the Conqueror did was invite Jews from France, from northern France, whom he knew in Normandy, to come to England to develop finance and commerce and trade and mercantilism, all the things that are required of a great country. And he knew the Jews had done this in Europe, and now he wanted them to do the same for his new kingdom in England. Just as an aside, Jews, Christians, and Muslims all have the same legal principle, which is that one cannot lend at interest to one's co-religionists. That's in the Torah for Jews, and it's also true of Christian and Muslim law and practice. So therefore, you can do an end run around this by having somebody from a different religion lend money to you. And so Jews became moneylenders throughout the Middle Ages, and through that developed trade and finance and so on. And if you're going to have capitalism, of course, that's what you need. And so this is the beginning, really, of modernity, even though we're still in the 11th century. That's the famous Bayeux Tapestry, which portrays the conquest of William the Conqueror. Nothing to do with Jews quite yet, but I thought I would just show you that lovely image. The Bayeux Tapestry sits in Bayeux Cathedral in Normandy. I've never seen it. Been to France a number of times, but never reached that corner of France. But President Macron has recently said that it will leave France for the first time in 950 years and will be on display in London soon. And they're going to need a big room for it because it is 70 meters long. Okay, think about what a football field is, 70 meters long by 50 centimeters high. So it's a very, very long tapestry. And there's a coin of William the Conqueror, except I know from my friends and colleagues in France and in England, the Bayeux Tapestry in the Brexit age is now being called the Bayeux Tapestry.
What's the coin? What's the coin on it?
It's a coin. It's very small, of course. I've blown it up. It's William the Conqueror.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, the first evidence for Jews in this time period comes from a remarkable document which cannot be dated explicitly. So we say around 1200. It might be slightly earlier. It's a good-sized Siddur, prayer book. So there's the whole volume, and here is the first page. And if you know the morning prayers, you can see that it starts with Untitled Chapter, the washing of hands, and then goes into Asher Yatzar et Hadam, who created God, who created humanity, and so on. So that is the Siddur. Okay, perfectly good Ashkenazi Siddur of the kinds that we know from Northern Europe, especially France, in the Middle Ages. Nothing, and this may look special to you, in my world this would not be all that special. What makes this truly special is the following. On the blank pages at the end of this Siddur, a Jew wrote in Hebrew script a list of the people who owed him money and the amounts. Is that what you do in the back of your Siddur? Now, the language here, the script is Hebrew, but the language is Arabic, and therefore we call this Judeo-Arabic. And it tells us, this informs us, that this was not a Jew from Northern Europe, but rather a Jew from Iberia, a Sephardic Jew, who made his way somehow to England to be engaged in the finance business. And here is the record, his documentation of the money that he lent to Christian dignitaries. Do a close-up. So, if you can see this word, so although it's a Sephardic cursive script, you have to be trained how to read this, but just to let you know, you can, those of you who are close enough, this is Anglaterra, England. And in this line, for example, min is the same in Hebrew and in Arabic. Min, bishop, Exeter, from the Bishop of Exeter. And right here, min, bishop, Bath, from the Bishop of Bath. And if you can see this word here, and this is plural, it's mark. The currency was mark. Okay, the old, we know it in the 20th century as the German mark. This was the currency in medieval England as well. Okay, so this is the record of this. This is housed now in Corpus Christi College Library, Oxford. We'll get to that a little bit later. It's just a remarkable document. Here's a close-up. I guess I should have shown you this, of what I was just showing you, the same couple of lines just to give you a sense of what it looks like. And here's an English translation. I know only those in the front can actually read it, but you can see in line 3 the mention of England, and in line 4 the Bishop of Exeter, and then the Bishop of Bath, and all sorts of other places. Actually, line 6 says count. Right here's the word count. Okay? Kuf, Vav, Nun, Taf. Okay? So they would just write out words like bishop and count. They didn't translate them into some Arabic equivalency. So it is simply a remarkable document and a testimony, right? This is the life of Jews in the Middle Ages coming alive as you see it right here. Okay, yeah.
What year would they put that writing?
Well, we don't know.
Yeah.
It's a rough estimate to around the year 1200. Oh. Right? So when I put a specific year down, like 1189, right here, that means we know exactly, precisely the year, and I'll explain to you why we know that for this document. But when we don't have a precise year, for example, I probably wrote on the previous image circa 1200, that's the best of guess, okay, from the experts who analyze handwriting, the physical properties of the parchment, and so on. Okay. Now, next document, truly one of the most remarkable documents from medieval England. This is known as Valmadona Manuscript Number 1, formerly owned by Jack Windsor in London, recently purchased in a private sale by the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., so it now has an MOTB cataloging number as well. It is dated to 1189 CE. It is a magnificent volume. I've seen it on display. First of all, I saw it at Sotheby's when it was on sale in New York, and then I've seen it more closely at the Museum of the Bible in Washington. This was just transferred from the Valmadona Trust in London via Sotheby's to the Museum of the Bible only within the last few years. Jack Windsor was a diamond merchant in London who collected Hebrew manuscripts. Valmadona is a small town in northern Italy where his wife's family was from, and so he named it the Valmadona Trust. This is the oldest dated manuscript from England, Hebrew manuscript from England. So it's right smack in that period, of course, that we've been talking about during the 11th and 12th century when Jews were very active. It is a complete copy of the Torah, beautifully, magnificently written, with the Targum Onkelos and the Haftarot and the Megillot, and the Megillot 5 scrolls as well. So this is the beginning of the book of Leviticus, just to give you an example of the image right here. And you can see the beginning of the book, of the parashah, rather, of Naso in the book of Numbers right here. So you have beautifully written manuscript here. How do we know its precise date? At the end of the manuscript, this is the very end right here, it's a sort of an epilogue to the Book of Esther, actually. It's not actually the Book of Esther. And this is the original colophon. You see I put that word here. Every page gets a number. This is folio 482V for verso, meaning the 482 sheets of parchment. Every sheet has a recto and a verso. And this is the original date can be calculated from this. And here you see probably these beautiful doodles as well, and all this text is later owners who wrote their names into the text as well. So here it is up close, and if you can read this, it tells you what the book contains, and here's the date. Okay, on the 15th day of the month of Tammuz in the year 4949, which, according to the Jewish calendar, which we can then calculate to be 1189 CE. So this is how we can date a manuscript precisely. Now, this gives us the date. This colophon does not give us the place, however. So how do we know that it comes from England? So that's where the detective work comes in. On Leviticus 11, where you have a list of forbidden birds, in the margins, here's the actual biblical text, in the margins, a scribe, maybe the original scribe, but most likely a second hand, wrote the names of the birds in what we call Judeo-French and Anglo-Norman. That is to say, it's in Hebrew letters, but the forbidden birds are put into the names that would be familiar to the person. After all, if you are living in medieval France or England and you have to know what birds you can and cannot eat, what good does it have? What good is it to have an ancient Hebrew word if you don't know what that bird is, right? And in this list, I don't have it close up, right? In this list right here is about as close as I can get. You see words like eagle, spelt, aleph, yod, gimel, lamed, yod, and osprey. It is the oldest attestation of the word osprey in any language in the world. It's not even attested yet in Latin, French, or English, and it's here in the 12th century in Hebrew letters. Okay. So quite remarkable. And an analysis of this by a linguist who works in Anglo-Norman, that is to say the English of the Norman period, and Northern French, Judeo-French, determined that this is absolutely reflective of English, okay, of right in the heart of Middle English. And that's how we know the text comes from England as well. Okay, so that took some detective work, and there's a specialist on everything in the world. You find the world's expert on this, and that person can inform us. So 1189, England, the beautiful Valmadona manuscript. Come to Washington and see it. Okay, third item. Merton College in Oxford, established in 1262, one of the oldest colleges in Oxford. Merton, Balliol, and University colleges all sort of debate which of them was the first formed. This is Merton College, and the college was purchased, the land rather, was purchased by Walter de Merton from Jacob the Jew. If you've heard that Jews could not own land in the Middle Ages, that was generally true, but there were exceptions of it, and Jews in Oxford owned land. This is the deed. It's a much larger document than this, by the way. It's still on display in the Merton College Library because the deed still has legal force down to the present day. Welcome to the wonder of Great Britain, right? Okay. And the deed is all in Latin. It's a very long text. And here, under it, is a line in Hebrew where Jacob the Jew affirms that everything that is written in Latin is agreeable and that this is a binding contract. If you know Hebrew, right here it says sharir v'kayam. Okay, the exact words that are used on all Hebrew contracts, including ketubot, marriage contracts. Okay, fascinating. And then the seal, this is dangling right here. The seal of Jacob the Jew is dangling, and you can go into the Merton College Library today and still see it. And yes, it's in force. Okay, as one of my colleagues in Britain once said, We are the only country that has not undergone political upheaval since the year 1066. Right? You know what happened in 1789 in France? They burned all the documents, and nobody knew which of the rich French people owned anything anymore, right? And so on with, you know, obviously Russia, major upheavals and so on. Okay, so this is still actually in effect. This is the oldest library in continuous use in the world, just as a little footnote, okay? And there is Merton College Library. Now, to bring this back into the 20th century, who was the most famous professor at Merton College? Maybe in its entire history, but certainly in the 20th century, was J.R.R. Tolkien. So it may be a bit of a stretch, but I like to think that if it weren't for Jacob the Jew in the 13th century, there would be no Lord of the Rings in the 20th century. And now a sidebar comment about Tolkien. There is a standard English Bible used by English-speaking Catholics called the Jerusalem Bible. It was actually translated by French scholars from the Hebrew into French. And then the English Catholics thought it was such a beautiful translation in the French, they translated it from the French into English. And they got all the great literary people in England who knew French sufficiently well to translate it into English. And one of them was Tolkien, who translated the Book of Jonah. So Tolkien didn't know Hebrew. He knew a lot, but not Hebrew. But he knew French, and he translated the Book of Jonah. And it was recently pointed out by someone, I had not known this, that when he translates the section of Jonah chapter 2, verses 6 through 7, he uses the expression "at the roots of the mountains." Those of you who know the poem of Jonah in chapter 2, and that the same expression actually occurs in the mouth of Gollum in Lord of the Rings, Book 1. Fascinating. That's what it means to be a philologist, a lover of words, right? As was Tolkien, as was the person who uncovered this, as am I. So let's go to the Shire, but not Tolkien's Shire, but rather the county of Wiltshire in southwestern England. And anybody here from England, from Wiltshire? Anybody from Wiltshire in particular? Okay, we all know where it is, southwestern England. And join me on my journey our journey. This was my wife Melissa and I together going to Longleat House, one of the great stately homes of England, the home of the Marquis of Bath. Why did we go there? Because in the library, in the private library of that home, is one of the most remarkable Hebrew manuscripts of the Middle Ages. So this is a Hebrew-Latin dictionary with some of the words occasionally glossed in French as well. It was written at Ramsey Abbey, and there's a photo of the remains of the abbey. It was closed down like all the abbeys by Henry VIII in the 16th century, and this one has not been kept up. And the monks there wrote this dictionary, and it's now in Longleat House. Every manuscript that I show you, every single manuscript has multiple stories. The scribe who wrote it, the person for whom he wrote it, where it's been kept for centuries, where it is today, and how it got there. Okay, so this is written in Ramsey Abbey in the 13th century. So you can see that every Hebrew word is listed here by the three-letter roots. Actually, these are the verbs right now, in the imperative form, which is quite an undertaking because most of these words don't appear in the imperative in biblical Hebrew. And then the monks wrote out in Latin how to pronounce it, in each case, at the head, and then the definition, right? And some notes if it was a word that required further explanation. There are almost 3,700 entries in this dictionary, divided into verbs and nouns. About 1,000 of the words are glossed into Old French in addition to the Latin. The Angevin kings, Norman and Angevin kings, and even the Plantagenets all used French in the court. Okay, that was the language of education, along with Latin. So English was for the general daily life, but the higher culture was all in French. And it mentions Rashi 50 times, by the way. How did these monks, right, in this Catholic monastery in 14th century, 13th, 14th century England know all this? Well, they must have learned this from their Jewish neighbors. They must have had access to Jewish scholars to be able to learn all this and then transmit it in Latin. And here it is in Longleat House today. Another portion of the same manuscript has the book of Psalms, and every single word is glossed in Latin. Right above it is, so it says Adam here, and you can't read this, I know, but it says homo, okay, the Latin word for man, and so on. So it's just remarkable that they were able to do this with notes. And then the latter, oh, here's a close-up, right? So homin, so the word for man, ish, the word for a male man, not the postman, but a male of the human species, is glossed as vir, vir being the Latin word for man, which comes into English in the word virile, for example. Okay, so they went through the entire book of Psalms and did this. Amazing, shows amazing knowledge of the Hebrew language by these Catholic monks. And then the last part of the manuscript is actually grammatical tables in Hebrew and Latin together, so you can learn the language. That's just fascinating. Okay. There were no photos permitted when we were there a couple of summers ago, so I can't show you actually what it looks like when we held it in our hands, but these are some stock photos that I was able to get from a colleague. Okay, and there's Longleat House. How did it get there? Because Thomas Stein, the first Viscount of Weymouth, you all remember him, purchased the manuscript because he was a bibliophile. Why would an English gentleman in the 17th century want a Hebrew-Latin dictionary? Because he could, right? As you will see. Now, there is a lachrymose side, of course, to English history in the middle of Jewish history in England in the Middle Ages. Lachrymose is one of those words that all my students have to learn. It's a word, fancy word, that means sad or tearful. And I always say to my students, why say sad or tearful when you can say lachrymose? But that's the term that was introduced into the literature by the great Jewish historian Salo Baron, and we continue to use it. I don't want to spend too much time on this. It's a whole other lecture, is what happened to the Jews. Things got bad in the 12th century. The blood libels, which started there in Norwich and in Lincoln. The massacre of the Jews of York in 1190, even though the Bishop of York attempted to protect them, the mob killed all the Jews. And then 100 years later, eventually the expulsion under Edward I in 1290. And then there were no Jews in England from 1290 to 1657. Okay. Until they were brought back under the Cromwells, okay? Under the Commonwealth of Oliver Cromwell. Okay. Throughout this period, Jewish learning, Hebrew learning, continued in England in the hands of Christians. Hopefully you all have your handout. You can follow. I don't have all the names there. There wasn't enough space on the handout. The only one I kept on the handout was Roger Bacon, because he was the great polymath of England who knew everything and learned everything from the Jews before they were expelled in 1290, and then he was able to sort of pass down that knowledge to later Christians. I always wanted to have a business card that just said polymath on it. That would be a great thing to have. Okay. And these were all, as you can see, mainly churchmen who fostered the knowledge of biblical Hebrew in particular, including one of the vice chancellors of the University of Oxford. Now, we now fast forward to the Renaissance. Yes?
Was there no correspondence between Jews abroad and the Christians of Britain in the church?
Okay, were there any correspondence between Jews abroad, meaning mainly France, and Germany and Britain during that 3 century plus gap? And I think the answer is generally no. Certainly not in the 13th and 14th centuries. And not in the 15th either. We do think, notwithstanding what I said, that a few exiles from Spain, Jewish exiles from Spain, may have made their way to England in the 1500s. And it's even possible that Queen Elizabeth I's physician was Jewish, but it's not clear. There would have been individual instances of Jews, not communities living in England. So in 1517, Oxford's already a couple hundred years old. New colleges are being founded all the time, and Corpus Christi College was founded in 1517. It just celebrated its 500th anniversary 2 years ago, and there was a big celebration in Oxford and actually in New York as well. Erasmus was alive at the time, and Erasmus actually visited Corpus Christi to see the new great wonder of this college, because it was founded explicitly, in Erasmus's words, as a bibliotheca trilinguis, that is to say Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. or I should say Hebrew, Greek, and Latin in that order, right? The three great classical languages. And if you're going to be educated, it meant not just knowing Latin, which every educated person knew, but it meant Greek and it meant Hebrew. And they learned it, and they learned it. And that Siddur that I showed you at the beginning is in the library of Corpus Christi College. Where it was from 1290 when the Jews were expelled until 1517, we have no idea. But we know it made its way into the Corpus Christi Library at some point, probably in the 16th century, at the founding or soon thereafter of the college. Again, welcome to England. And there it is. Now, soon thereafter, actually within just a few years, yes?
So what does Corpus, is that a theological seminary?
No. So the colleges in England, notwithstanding its name, the colleges in England provide accommodation, dining, intramural activities such as sport and so on. All instruction takes place in the faculty. So there's a faculty of theology at Oxford. There's a Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. There's a faculty of classics, of history, of chemistry, and so on. So it's a bit of a web matrix where you have the colleges doing their thing with faculty and students, but the actual instruction takes place in other faculties, in more standardized, what we call departments in the U.S. university. Very complicated system. Very complicated system. So you could live in Corpus and be a chemistry student today, or an English major, or Greek classics, or whatever.
Like Mandelbaum House.
Like Mandelbaum House, right? Where you can live here in this college and study whatever subject you would like. So the 16th century, right after Corpus is created, is the beginning of the English Reformation, and I've left out captions of two people because I hope you know Henry VIII on the left and Her Majesty Elizabeth I on the right. The one person you probably don't know is Thomas Bodley. So Henry VIII created the Regius Professorships of Hebrew at Cambridge and 6 years later in Oxford. The idea of the Reformation was the break with Rome meant we're not going to, we'll continue to do Latin, of course, but the break from Rome meant we're going to go back to the original sources, Hebrew for what Christians call the Old Testament and Greek for the New Testament. You're going to have to learn Hebrew and Greek. You can no longer access the Bible through a Latin translation. You have to go back to the original languages. And to do that, Henry VIII established, to foster that, he established Regius Professorships of Hebrew and Greek in the two universities. And by the way, they continue to this day. The original salary, by the way, was £40, which was probably quite a bit of money in 1540. I know both close colleagues and personal friends, the Regius Professor, both in Oxford and in Cambridge, and hopefully their salaries have increased a bit over the last 5 centuries. But those are prestigious chairs of Hebrew that continue ad hayom hazeh, down to the present day. Now, one of the early holders was a Frenchman. There were Englishmen as well, but he was unusual to be a Frenchman, Antoine Chevalier, who was the Regius Professor in Cambridge for some time period in the 16th century. He was the tutor of Thomas Bodley in Hebrew, of Thomas Bodley and Queen Elizabeth. How many of you know that Queen Elizabeth learned Hebrew? She certainly knew many languages, English, French, Latin, Greek, I think Spanish. She knew quite a bit, right? But there is some evidence that she also knew Hebrew and that her tutor was Chevalier. So he had two illustrious students, Thomas Bodley and Her Majesty the Queen, at that point still Princess. Now, Thomas Bodley went on to found the Bodleian Library, which still bears his name to the present day. There's the statue of Thomas Bodley out front, and this is the old quad of the Bodleian Library. I wanted to make it authentic, so it's raining right there. Hopefully you can see that. And he was a Hebraist. He collected Hebrew manuscripts. There are no Jews in England during this time period. He collected Hebrew manuscripts, and the first catalog of the Bodleian Library includes 58 books. Now, it's already, by this time, the age of printing, books and manuscripts that Thomas Bodley owned. And in the catalog, you can actually see, which was produced in Latin, he makes corrections in the margins where he corrected the Hebrew, because only he really knew the Hebrew, not the typesetter of the catalog, and so on. And that's the library in which I personally have spent a good portion of my life. I've been blessed to do that. And here he is, face here, Thomas Bodley, and that's actually the main entrance to the quad, to the library. So the quad, you had a sense of it, is on 4 sides, and notice one of the doors is the Schola Linguarum, the School of Languages, built 1605 approximately. What did that mean? Can everybody see what it says? Hebrew and Greek. Well, it was obvious you knew Latin, otherwise you couldn't get into the university. We don't have to teach you that. But in the Schola Linguarum, you learned Hebrew and Greek. And that was through this doorway along with the geometry and arithmetic. Fascinating. You can still see it today. It's not an old photo. You just walk up there today and take the photo just like that. Hebrew's no longer taught right here. Okay. Oxford has expanded considerably in the last 400 years, but the sign remains. Just to show you some of the things that Bodley himself owned, this is a book of Psalms. If you can read the Hebrew, you can see Psalm 1 right here. Ashrei Ha'ish, noble is the man, etc. And there's all sorts of wording here that was put in by the original librarian probably, and it mentions the date, 1624, Bodley, Oriental Manuscript number 3. He owned and donated into the library a bilingual prayer book in Hebrew and Catalan. How did he get this? Somehow it made its way, probably after the expulsion in 1492 from one of those Jews who made his way up the Atlantic coast, and somehow it fell into Bodley's hands. Did he buy it in Amsterdam or have an agent in Amsterdam where a lot of the Sephardi Jews went? Or in Bayonne or Bordeaux in southern France, which had large Sephardi communities. Anyway, here it is in Catalan. If you know the prayers, you see this is the Olenu prayer on the left and Adon Olam on the right. How many of you know that the Sephardic version of Adon Olam has an additional verse? How many of you know that? You should all know that. Okay. That additional verse is right here. Okay. B'li erech, b'li dimyon, etc. Okay. So there it is. And every word is glossed. Okay. So, right. So my Catalan is, I mean, I just stated with my knowledge of Spanish, but you know, here it says Gidola, so it says something like Grandizo. Okay, big, large. Right? Every word gets a Catalan gloss. And here it is, as are actually my fingers, here it is in my hands. It's a relatively small volume, that's what I wanted to show you. I can see the word melech, and under it says rey, same word in Spanish, and in Italian and in Catalan. Okay, that's it. John Selden. John Selden. Now I'm going to, these are all on your handout. John Selden was one of the most remarkable men in 17th century England. He was a jurist, and he is alive right up to the time of the English Civil War, and the Cromwell's taking over, and dies during that time period. But all the rage in that 17th century was to create sort of a new legal system for England. And they all turned to John Selden, and because this was this new Church of England, still relatively new with its Old Testament roots and its obsession, I'm going to say, I mean obsession here in a good way, of the Jewish Bible, Selden went and learned Jewish law. Not just the Hebrew of the Bible, but later post-biblical Jewish law. He knew it all. And his manuscript collection entered the Bodleian in 1659. I'll get my little notes here. Just to tell you how remarkable he was a contemporary of John Milton, and Milton called Selden, quote, the chief of learned men reputed in this land. He's still read today by political theorists. Okay, anybody who does the history of political theory, history of government, history of law, they all know the name John Selden. Okay, yes?
Just trying to understand how they expelled the Jews.
Right.
So they hate the Jews. And at the same time, they're studying Jewish law, they're studying Hebrew. So they're studying something they hate? Or
no.
How does it work?
Let me just put that question aside by telling you the following. Nobody to this day knows why Edward I expelled the Jews in 1290. We know why he hated the Scots. You realize it's the same person who had William Wallace put to death. But there's still no historical evidence as to why he did what he did. So I don't think, I would not say they hated the Jews, and maybe that was the case of Edward I in the 13th century. But you're now at a time of philo-Semitism. And it was only a matter of a few years after Selden's death when the Jews were readmitted to England. This is what he owned. He owned Maimonides, a manuscript of Maimonides' Mishneh Torah. Remember, there are already printed books. He could have bought a printed version of Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, his Code of Jewish Law. So this manuscript comes from 1170. You know what that means? Maimonides was alive when this manuscript was written. Maimonides lived in the 12th century. No, I take that, my mistake. That's when it was written. This manuscript was 1350, after Maimonides passed away. So I jumped ahead of myself here. So here is this manuscript of Maimonides, and this is what he's reading. It doesn't have an English translation. It doesn't have a Latin translation. John Selden was able to read the Rambam in Hebrew. But not just Maimonides was famous. He actually owned a copy of the Sefer Mitzvot HaGadol, written in 13th century France. What's known as, in Hebrew acronym, SMOG. Rabbi, you studied SMOG, right? John Selden, a non-Jew in 17th century England, is reading this book of the commandments, trying to figure out how the Jews do law, because that's what we should do in England as well. But wait a minute. Not just law, but what else Selden owned? He owned a Machzor, the prayer book for the holidays. You see the big word Melech there. Because he wanted to see what Jewish liturgy was like. And just because he could, he also owned a Kabbalistic text, a famous Kabbalistic text called Otsar HaKavod, not as famous as the Zohar, but a well-known text. I didn't put a photo of it here because I wanted to show you the first page, or the inside flyleaf, where it's written in various handwritings here. You can see abbreviations for Selden. So in Hebrew, Otsar HaKavod, in English it's collection of glory. But the librarians were all still thinking in Latin. So it says here, Thesaurus Gloria. Thesaurus means collection. Thesaurus Gloria, collection of glory, Otsar HaKavod. See how they all were thinking in the multiple languages. And John Selden owned all those manuscripts. The next individual is Edward Pocock. It was during his lifetime that Jews were readmitted into England, and began to prosper very quickly in the 17th century. Pocock was Regis Professor of Hebrew in Oxford, but he also held the chair in Arabic. He did both languages with equal expertise. But he served, when he was younger, as chaplain to the Levant Company of Aleppo. So the British already were beginning to expand their interest in the Middle East, and eventually, of course, it would all reach India in the 18th century. And they had British merchants in Aleppo, and they needed a chaplain, of course, so he was also a divine. He also was an ordained Anglican priest. So off he went to the Middle East. But with his interest in Hebrew and Arabic, he started purchasing manuscripts in the Middle East. This is a book of Exodus, manuscript Pocock 7. This is now in, these are all in the Bodleian Library. We'll get to the right ones, don't worry. Okay. He owned a commentary on Ibn Ezra. This is the commentary, this is Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, his commentary on the Mishnah, that Pocock owned. This one was written during Maimonides' lifetime. This is a scribe who wrote this, but this is actually Maimonides' handwritten drawing of the temple. Owned by Pocock, now in the Bodleian Library. There's the altar, here's the Holy of Holies. And you can view all of these, it's on your handout at the Bodleian website, which I'll show you in a minute. A close-up. Ma'arav, West, Holy of Holies, Heichal, Menorah, Shulchan. I actually can't make out the second word. It should say incense altar, but it's the altar of something that I can't. Is it saying Hazahav? I thought so, but I wasn't sure. The golden altar. Here's Sha'ar HaGadol, the great gate. So this is Maimonides drew out the temple as he understood the way it looked.
Which temple?
The temple as described in the Mishnah, the second temple. Almost as good as his manuscripts, or if you're a botanist, even better than his manuscripts. Pocock brought back a sapling from Syria, a small plane tree, and planted it on the grounds of Christchurch College. That's Christchurch Cathedral. It's it's the smallest cathedral in England, but it's a cathedral attached to Christchurch College, one of the colleges. And that tree is now almost 400 years old, and it has grown to this. I also have a photo of me standing there. I take up this much space, and the outer branches are held up by big posts, like telephone poles that they put up just to hold the branches up. That's the famous Pocock tree, and part of the lore of Christchurch College that a later mathematician there in the 19th century named Charles Dodgson, who wrote under the pen name Lewis Carroll, designed the Jabberwocky after this tree. Robert Huntington, another one of these great collectors. He was obsessed with Maimonides. There are 8 copies extant from before the age of printing of Maimonides' medical aphorisms, because remember, he was a great physician as well. Huntington owned 2 of them, which he also purchased in the Middle East and brought back to Britain. And there's Robert Huntington's own signature. But most importantly, he brought back Maimonides' own copy of the Mishneh Torah, his own commentary, his own code of Jewish law. The Bodleian has a dedicated website. How do we know it's Maimonides' own copy? First of all, here's the manuscript. He didn't write this, right? This is a scribe who wrote this, a professional scribe. Maimonides was far too busy to write hundreds of pages and didn't have good handwriting, as we know. But Huntington himself signed it on the first folio, 1R, and actually wrote in the beginning a verse from the book of Job that Huntington wrote out, apparently in his own handwriting. For the in the elderly is wisdom, and for those who have length of days, understanding. Okay. And how do we know this is Maimonides' own copy? Because on this particular page, 165a, the scribe wrote out the table of contents, and then Maimonides signed it right here. That's his signature. And he writes in his own hand, Huga Nisi Free, checked against my book, meaning my copy. Ani Moshe Rabbi Maimon. I, Moses, the son of Maimon. And then in Arabic at the end, an homage to his father. That's Maimonides' own handwriting. Huntington found this in the Middle East, brought it back to England. It's in the Bodleian Library today.
Where in the Middle East?
Probably Aleppo. That's where he was stationed, like Pocock. And it's all digitalized, thank you to Leonard Polanski of London, who has paid for the digital project of the Bodleian manuscripts, but it's a shared website with the Vatican Library as well. So all the Hebrew manuscripts of Bodleian and the Vatican share this website, and you can look at anything that I've shown you there. Go have fun, and it's just remarkable. The British Museum. One of the gems on public display on the ground floor, the entranceway to the British Museum, not far from where they displayed Magna Carta, is the Golden Haggadah, a beautiful manuscript from Barcelona, 1320 approximately. This is all hand-painted, as you can imagine. Death of the firstborn, Israelites leaving Egypt, Egyptian army in pursuit, looking awfully like medieval knights, but there they are, and the splitting of the sea and the drowning of the Egyptians. You're going to have some printed Haggadah next week at your Seder table, and I recommend getting into the British Library and taking this out. I mean, it's just phenomenal what these manuscripts look like from the Middle Ages. So, just to clarify, all these manuscripts were collected by the British Museum. 30 years ago, they were all transferred to the British Library. So the museum, the library, the British Library had a new building built, and the manuscripts were taken away from the British Museum and now put inside the British Library, who now has ownership of them. And so they have both British Museum BM and British Library BL numbers. They're all they've kept the numbers the same, but sometimes you'll see different prefixes depending on when somebody was writing about such and such manuscript. Now, the Duke of Sussex, not Prince Harry, who was the most recent Duke of Sussex, okay, but the first Duke of Sussex, Prince Augustus Frederick. Who was he? Son of George III, brother of the next king, George IV. Of all the sons of George III, they all went into the army or the navy, except for the Duke of Sussex, who was a bibliophile, and he learned Hebrew and collected Hebrew manuscripts, including the famous Duke of Sussex Bible, which is now in the British Library, written in Catalonia around 1350. Here he is as an older man, looking very regal. He was the favorite uncle of Queen Victoria. He gave Queen Victoria away at her wedding to Prince Albert, because her father had already passed away. And so her favorite uncle did this, walked her down the aisle. He was governor of Windsor Castle. He fought for the emancipation of the Jews, for full civil rights of the Jews, learned Hebrew, corresponded in Hebrew with Jews, as I'll show you. And he was the royal benefactor, the first one for the newly founded Jews Hospital and Orphan Asylum, which morphed into the Norwood Charity. How many of you know about Norwood Charity, right, from the UK? It all starts because the Duke of Sussex gave it royal benefaction. Okay, a remarkable individual whose full life story still needs to be written, and we'll come back to him. Now, the British Museum didn't have a single person in the Middle East going off like Huntington and Pocock and other people who brought stuff back to Oxford, but they had an agent named Moses Wilhelm Shapira in Jerusalem, a Polish Jew who converted to Christianity, took on the name Wilhelm, and obtained manuscripts mainly from Yemenites, bought them, Jews who made their way to the land of Israel, and then he sold them to the British Museum, including the best and most important copy we have of Targum Onkelos. And there's Shapira's signature on the manuscript as he sold it off to the British Museum, now British Library again. Another Targum, known as Targum Yerushalmi, sold from Shapira, collected by him in the Middle East, sold to the British Museum, now in the British Library. And here's a colophone, which allows us, it doesn't give us a date, unfortunately, but it gives us a little bit about the book. And so there's that colophone. This is what you learn when you read manuscripts, but you, as I said, the biggest collection of all this materials in England. It says Tam D'Ishlam, it's completed. Shevach leborei olam, praise to the creator of the world. And then my favorite line, Chazak hakotev, the one who wrote it, may he be strengthened, because he's very tired now, having just written this manuscript. The Amitz HaKoreh, and the one who's going to read it, may he also have strength. Okay. Anybody know what this is? Under it? First of all, it's in Latin. You see the date, 1598. It's the censor's signature. A Christian censor went through it to make sure that it was okay for Jews to use, and he signed off on it and said it's fine. And there's his name in 1598. Okay? And we have his signature on a number of Hebrew manuscripts. All this took place in Italy, but there you have the censor's signature. Anybody know who this is? Yes? Sir Charles Nicholson, founder of this university. Shapira sent, sold manuscripts to Nicholson. And they're here in Fisher Library, including this Yemenite Torah scroll, complete Yemenite Torah scroll, manuscript Nicholson 37, sold from Shapira to Nicholson, who then brought it from England to Australia. It's in Fisher Library.
Isn't it odd that there's two wooden, like, the stadium have usually one scroll? They're only one.
The other two that I'm going to show you only have one each. So this is a bit unusual. But it may have been that somebody put them on secondarily. I don't know how old the wood is. And two others. This one has one piece of wood here, and this one has a wood thing here. But these are both incomplete. Okay. The previous one is a complete Torah scroll. Okay. So Nicholson, I hope you accept him as an Australian, but he was an Englishman collecting all this material. Okay. And myself, my wife Melissa, and Professor Ian Young from the university were there earlier this week, holding these items and taking some photographs. These are our own photos. And this one on the bottom, I have to tell you, I wish I could just have you come up to the screen and touch it. This is a suede feel. I've never felt a parchment like this. It's absolutely wonderfully produced from goat skin. Alan Crown cataloged all of these back in the 70s and 80s. This one was owned by the Duke of Sussex. This is in Fisher Library. This was owned by the Duke of Sussex. This is his nameplate. Charles Nicholson bought it eventually, and that's his nameplate right there. This is the catalog of the Duke of Sussex's library. How do we know that the Duke of Sussex owned all this? Because during his lifetime, his librarian, Thomas Joseph Pettigrew, created a 3-volume catalog of everything that was in the Duke's library. Now, here's the title page, but I've blown this up a little bit, and this is worth reading. Thomas Joseph Pettigrew, Doctor of Philosophy of the University of Göttingen, member of the Royal College of Surgeons, Fellow of the Medical Society, corresponding member of the Academy of the Arts, etc. Surgeon to their Royal Highness the Duke of Sussex, the Duchess of Kent, the Princess Victoria, she wasn't queen yet, and librarian to HRH, the Duke of Sussex. How many physicians in the room? Anyone? Okay. Could you also catalog Hebrew manuscripts? Any librarians in the room? Could you also do surgery? Okay. This was the 19th century remarkable, I was going to say the Victorian era, well, it wasn't quite Victorian yet. Multitasking. These individuals are amazing. And he wrote letters in Hebrew, including one that's been printed to his friend Rabbi Abraham Beleus of London. Just unbelievable to do this. The Rylands Library. I showed this a few lectures ago. The Cathedral to Learning, established by Mrs. Rylands after the death of her husband in 1900. I showed you this image before. The oldest fragments of the Septuagint in the world are in Manchester. But let's look at medieval material. 2 gems of Haggadot. Again, we have to get by with our little printed books at our table. The medieval Jews, they only had 1 copy per table, of course. But they had these unbelievable manuscripts, including this one, Rylands number 6. Can everybody see the big gold leaf letters? This is all done in gold leaf and tones. It had been owned previously, before Mrs. Rylands purchased it, by the way, by the 25th Earl of Crawford. Why did he own Hebrew manuscripts? Because he was an Englishman and he could. That's the mantra for tonight. And he also owned this one, which eventually fell into the Rylands' hands through some purchases. Number 7, this is a Sephardic Haggadah. No, they're both Ashkenaz. Oh, that's my mistake. I should say, it's my mistake. It's not the Ashkenazi Haggadah, this is from Catalonia. This is the Ashkenazi Haggadah, written in Old German, 15th century. And you can see the big gold leaf for Ha-Haman. And that brings us to Cambridge next. And Cambridge had been collecting manuscripts all along, but of course the name of Solomon Schechter was forever tied to the university there and the finding of the Cairo Museum. This is the Ben Ezra Synagogue, to which Schechter traveled in 1896 to empty its contents. The story is more complicated than that, as I'll show you in a moment, and bring back 200,000 manuscripts to Cambridge. He was assisted by the Scottish Presbyterian twin sisters, Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson. Their portraits are hanging in Westminster College in Cambridge today. They were very close friends of Solomon Schechter, and I'll explain to you why. First of all, they were educated. Their father was a Presbyterian minister. They grew up in Scotland. They moved to Cambridge. They befriended Solomon Schechter. Their father, Reverend Smith, tutored his children in Greek and Hebrew and Latin and so on, and Aramaic. They learned all the languages. They couldn't get into university because it was the 1870s and 1880s, and women were not yet admitted. But they moved to Cambridge anyway, and they befriended Solomon Schechter, and they became a trio of scholars who worked together. And as everybody realizes, they became friends with Schechter because they were the outcasts in Church of England, Cambridge. You wouldn't want to deal with Scottish Presbyterians now, would you, if you were from the Church of England? And a Jewish scholar like Schechter, all very well respected in the academy, but I think they always felt a little bit like outcasts, and therefore they found themselves. But the one member of the Church of England who befriended all of them was the master of St. John's College. Which college were you at? Queens. Queens, okay. The master of a very lovely place as well. The master of St. John's, Charles Taylor, another Hebraist. He wrote a commentary on Pirkei Avot, the tractate of the Mishnah. And he sponsored Schechter's trip to Cairo to bring back the manuscripts to Cambridge. They just all knew Hebrew, all of these people. And here's the iconic picture of Schechter with the crates of manuscripts as he's sorting them out, Bible, Mishnah, Talmud, etc. It's a little more complicated than what I've just suggested to you, because although Schechter gets the big credit, others had traveled to Cairo before him and had purchased manuscripts or brought back manuscripts to England, including 30,000 of them, 25,000 of them, brought back by Elkan Nathan Adler, the son of one chief rabbi and the brother of the next chief rabbi. Okay, son of Chief Rabbi Nathan Adler, brother of Rabbi Herschel Adler. And I asked Rabbi Elton beforehand, the Adler Siddur, people still use it here in Australia. He said at the Great Synagogue they use it. That's written by his son, Herschel Adler. Okay, and a plug to Rabbi Elton's work, because he told me that his PhD was on the chief rabbinate of England during this very time period. So you know more about the Adlers than anybody else in the world. Right? Fair statement. But the brother, the son, the other son of the first chief rabbi and the brother of the other one, was a bibliophile and traveled to England, and he found his own documents, which actually wound up in New York at the Jewish Theological Seminary today. But the Bodleian was collecting them through other means. This is a list, the largest, and the Rylands as well, the largest collections in Cambridge by far. But as you can see, large collections at JTS in New York, the Bodleian, the Rylands themselves. That's the Cambridge University Library today. That's not where Schechter was working. This was built in the 1930s. The building where Schechter was working is still standing today, but it's now used for administration. This is the new library. It was built in the 1930s. And as you go in and you work your way through its corridors, you find this sign. I think it's safe to say that Melissa and I could now find this blindfolded because we've turned these corridors so often. You can see the signage to take you to the Geniza Research Unit. And there we are inside, myself with three of my main colleagues in Cambridge, Ben Oathwaite, who is the director of the Geniza Research Unit, his assistant, Melanie Schmeier-Lee, and Kim Phillips, a wonderful, brilliant young scholar working on manuscripts there. Melanie, by the way, everybody see the spelling of her name, and when I asked her where her name came from, she's Aussie. Her father was a melon farmer in Australia. Melanie was spelled Melanie. It all comes back to Australia. We have to personalize the whole talk. And this is what we do. We sit and we read manuscripts. They're all digitalized today. You can find all these online at geniza.org. I gave you that website too. But there's nothing like the experience of looking at them firsthand. As I always say, on the computer screen, on the computer screen, they all take up the same size. But you don't know if they're this big or this big. Yeah. Now, it's true that they have a little centimeter ruler on the side of the image, but you really ever look at it and figure out, oh, that's 8 centimeters or 10 until you really hold it and see the font size. We're going to end the evening back in Oxford, more or less where we began. The new Weston Library opened across the street from the Bodleian a few years ago, 5 years ago now. And that's where all the manuscripts are now kept. Here I am there reading some of these Geniza manuscripts. One particular one that I had a special interest in. Don't worry, that's a pencil in my hand. When you go in, no drinks, no pens.
Gloves
no, you don't have to use gloves. Occasionally some places want you to use gloves, usually not. You have your pencil, a notebook, and a camera. You can have your laptop, but this is what you do. And there's nothing like, they want you to touch these things, by the way. They want you to touch all these documents. You know why? Especially if they're parchment. Parchment has to breathe. Anything made out of leather, parchment is leather, right? That leather coat that you haven't worn in 10 years, or that leather belt, what happens to it? It gets brittle. They want some of the moisture from your hands that should go on the parchment. Benjamin Kennicott. He's on your handout, but I skipped over him because I saved the best for last. Keeper of the Radcliffe Library, which is this iconic building in central Oxford, in the 18th century. He traveled all over Europe collecting Hebrew manuscripts, biblical manuscripts. He's only interested in Bible. And the crown jewel that he purchased in Italy is the Kennicott Bible. which is now known simply as the Kennicott Bible. Written in La Coruña, Spain. That's the opening page, Genesis chapter 1. Where did the Jews get the idea, by the way, to put the big first letter bet inside a box like this? Their Christian neighbors did it with their manuscripts, right? The big Latin letter at the beginning. The Jews started doing that as well. La Coruña is in the far northwest of Spain. Can't get further northwest. That's where this manuscript is. Just to show you how beautiful it is. Each parashah, it's the whole Tanakh, the whole Bible, but for the Torah sections, each parashah has a new, has some artwork, okay? This is the parashah of Bo from the book of Exodus. This is the splitting of the sea in Exodus 14. You like the way the columns are split, you know, with the image of the splitting of the sea. This is the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15, and again you see a little artwork here where the words go through the water, through the blue. Scribes are doing wonderful things, right? These are not Torah scrolls, right? These are actual books, what we call a codex, all the manuscript pages. You wouldn't use this in a synagogue for liturgical purposes, but you would own it to read. The final page of Deuteronomy, it's going to go further. Final page of the Torah. Beginning of the book of Kings, the elderly King David. Where did the artist get this idea of this image of King David? I ask with a smile. Playing cards. These are medieval Spanish playing cards. That's the king, the medieval Spanish playing cards. And an art historian finally figured out why the image of King David looks the way it looks. May I remind you that these scribes shared the same workshop. Jews and Christians shared the same workshop. We know this. And they went to the same parchment market, the same vellum market. They had the same inks, the same paints, the same this. And so the scribes copying in Latin were right next to the scribes copying in Hebrew. And after a while, the manuscripts begin to look alike, except for the language. It's fascinating. This is the audience participation of our program. What book is this? Everybody got an A on the exam. Every book begins with an image. This is the colophon at the very end. The last page, it's actually the next to last page. The last page shows you this. And we'll blow up that upper right-hand portion. It gives you this information here. I have the English on the next image, but just to read a little Hebrew. Ani Moshe, the Rabbi Yaakov, Ibn Zabara, HaSofer, the name of the scribe. Katafti, the Nikadati, Masarti, Hageti, Ela, Arba'im, Esrim, Sfarim. I wrote, and I put in the dots and dashes for the vowels, and I checked the Masorah, the Masoretic notes, and I proofread these 24 books of the Bible. The Kovitz Achad, in one collection. And he concluded it on such and such a date, which we can now calculate as 1476. And he tells you here, in the middle, that he did it for the Bachor, the young man, Bachor Nechmad, the young man, Yitzchak ben Kavod Hayakar Don Shlomo de Braga. He wrote it for the young man, Isaac, the son of his glorious honor, Shlomo de Braga. Okay? A man named Solomon Shlomo who came from the city of de Braga, which is not far from this place. And the word Don, if you can read Hebrew, is the Spanish word Don, but it's written in Hebrew letters. And here's the English translation of it. That's the Kennicott Bible. It doesn't get better than that except for the following. The next page is the colophon of the artist. Because Moshe, the scribe, told us what he did, but he didn't say he illustrated the book, because he's a scribe, but he's not necessarily the artist. He left space for the artist, and this is a full page. And these are called zoomorphic letters. I'll show you close up in a moment. Ani Yosef ben Chaim zeh hasefer tziyarti v'hishlamti. I, Joseph, son of Chaim, this book I illustrated and I completed. The other guy may have done a lot of work, but I completed it. And here's a close-up of 2 of the letters. And yes, avert your eyes, there are naked women, and naked men, and rabbits, and snails, and a cat, and you do whatever you, some sort of leopard, you do whatever you can to make the English, the Hebrew letters. That is phenomenal. It's online as well. You can look at them all. Benjamin Kennicott purchased this in Italy. So we can assume that a Jewish family, 1476, right here, this is the website, 1476, 16 years before the expulsion from Spain. This shows you, it indicates to you what a wealthy Jewish community existed in Spain in the 15th century. That if one person could have a Bible created like this, I'm sure he wasn't the only one. And look how many other Bibles from Spain I showed you, which are now in English. And most likely we recreate a story where this Jewish family left Spain in 1492, made their way to Italy, and it was still there in the 1700s in Italy when Benjamin Kennicott bought the manuscript and brought it back to the Bodleian Library. There are many Kennicott manuscripts, but this one is known as the Kennicott Bible. Apologies if I put myself in these pictures, but I want to give you a sense of my life. Okay, this is what I do. Okay, and here I am with my colleague Cesar Merchan Haman, the head of Hebraic Library, head Hebraic Library at the Bodleian, and this was just last summer. I had seen it before, but every time I go back, I want to see it again, and he, is always happy to bring it out. And there it is in its box, and he and I are looking at it together. And you see it. This is my own photo here. Opened up to Jonah. Okay, and yes, turn the pages. Yes, you see, we're just using our hands, right? No gloves. Okay, they want a little moisture from it. Okay. England as the custodian of the Jewish past. I hope you've gotten just a little bit of insight into what I mean by that. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Professor Rendsburg for that presentation. There'll now be a question period. How long do we have for questions? Until run out of steam. Yes, please.
How come the Egyptian Cairo papers, they were so willing or happy to give away so many hundreds of thousands of documents?
So the question is, why was the Cairo Jewish community willing to give away so many, in this case 300,000 documents, during the 1880s and especially 1896 when Schechter arrived there? We don't know the answer to these things fully. They may have sensed that they would be of use to scholars and researchers in Europe. And remember, Adler came with credentials. The son of the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom is not a bad credential, right? So he was able to purchase them. They were not a gift to him. He purchased them. It was also a way for the community to make money, even though the Cairo Jewish community was relatively wealthy into the 19th and 20th centuries. I can tell you that when Schechter arrived in 1896 with a letter from Herman Adler, I think it would have been in 1896, the chief rabbi, a letter of introduction. We do know that Schechter endeared himself to the rabbi of the synagogue. And the rabbi basically said to him, after they were together for several weeks in Cairo, you'd seen the material, even though Schechter was given the funds by Charles Taylor to purchase them, the rabbi of the community, who liked Schechter so much, basically said to him, take whatever you would like. And Schechter emptied out the contents, so there was nothing left. The last 200,000 documents. Some were probably still in the hands of dealers, and they were sold here and there. So that's how it all happened. Schechter still had to use Taylor's funds, by the way, to ship them back to England. And the story is fascinating, by the way. He took them to the port of Alexandria. He had help from the British consul. He took them to the port of Alexandria, put them on a ship for Liverpool, and wrote a letter to his wife Matilda to go meet the ship in Liverpool, while he went off to the land of Israel to go see his brother, who had moved to Israel from their native Romania to start a vineyard. I don't understand how he could have let those documents out of his hand, but he figured, I'll be close enough to see my brother, I'll do that, and the ship will get to England, and my wife will get them to Cambridge, and that's exactly what happened. So the story ends fine, but I just wanted little vignettes, about the people who deal with these documents. Yes, yes, in the back.
There's
There's
Oh,
a
sorry.
company in the UK called Facsimile Edition,
Yes,
which have done a facsimile of the Pinnacle Bible.
right, thank you for reminding us about that. Is that what you were showing me at your mobile phone?
Yeah.
Yeah, Facsimile Editions is this company in the UK. Do they only do Hebrew manuscripts? I think so.
No, they don't.
They do everything?
Started out just doing Hebrew,
Okay.
but they do the most fascinating things. At the moment, they're doing some very, very old documents from Ethiopia.
Oh, wonderful.
So
And the facsimile edition of the Kanakah Bible is
One of these.
£10,000? Or?
yeah, so what they do is they either do facsimile editions of an entire book, or if it's a particularly beautiful illuminated page, they will just do a page, and you can either buy a page or buy the whole.
Frame it at home.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for reminding us. Yes, you can purchase your copy of the Kanakah Bible if you would like.
7,900.
£8,000. Okay. A bargain. I thought it was 10,000.
You spoke about British involvement in Aleppo
Right.
in the early 17th century.
Right.
But the British were already in India. 1600 was the East India Company, the early days of it. Before they already had the factory, the so-called factories,
Right.
there at the time of the Mughal emperors. So they weren't really further east than.
Already they were. I always think of 1750, so that maybe that's when.
No, well, that's when they sort of
became
took
part
over.
That's when the Raj begins, right? So, okay, so the English were already there in the 1600s, as were the Dutch and the Portuguese, everybody was in India. And, but they also had their designs in the Middle East, including Persia, so yeah, thank you for that.
You said a few words, please, about America as the custodian of the Jewish past and Israel as the custodian of the
Okay.
Jewish past.
Thank you. So, the largest collection of documents in the U.S. is at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. They not only have the 25,000 or 30,000 documents that Adler collected in Cairo, and he did take them back to England, but they were in his private hands until the 1920s or 30s, when he sold them to JTS in New York. And JTS was also collecting documents and manuscripts. Remember, they were a young institution. They were founded around 1890, and Schechter left Cambridge to go to become the president of JTS in New York. So they have by far the best collection. I don't know the number of thousands of manuscripts they have. I've been into the back room, actually, and just a little anecdote, which I'd love to tell you. So the storehouse, I mean, anything you want to read at the JTS library, you go and they bring it to you on a table, like same in Oxford and so on. But I've been behind the scenes in Cambridge and Oxford and at JTS, and the room at JTS where they're all stored has a special security system that if a fire were to start and the alarms went off, no sprinklers, because that would damage the manuscripts. You were a student there, right? All of the air was sucked out of the room immediately to prevent any fire from spreading onto the manuscripts. And they tell you when you go back there, if the alarm should sound, get out immediately, because there'll be no oxygen in the room. And the reason they set the system up that way is you're replaceable, but the manuscripts are not.
And Israel?
Israel. Israel, as an even younger nation, of course, has even fewer manuscripts. The National Library in Israel does have a good collection, but nothing like what you see here. That said, the National Library of Israel is engaged presently in a project called Kativ, the Hebrew word for writing, which is trying to coordinate the digitalization of all Hebrew manuscripts in the world. So it's a massive project. So they're taking all the ones in all the libraries I've mentioned, and you can actually access them through one database. Okay. I should mention that the person who started that, and the person who was the chief librarian of the National Library of Israel, is Malachi Beit Aryeh, whose name I did not have an opportunity to mention, who is the world's authority on Hebrew manuscripts. And I call him my teacher, because anything I've learned about Hebrew manuscripts, I learned from him. Twice I had the good fortune, although I've seen him in the US and in Israel, twice I've had the good fortune of being his neighbor in Oxford. And he is actually the one who published and identified the Baal Madonna #1 manuscript of that beautiful 1189 Hebrew Bible text that I started with. That's now at the Museum of the Bible. So Beit Aryeh is the world's greatest scholar. He turned 80 last year. on Hebrew manuscripts, and all of us who know anything about the field are indebted to him. He created the whole field of study that we can now know what we know.
Is it possible that the reason that the English was so interested in the Hebrew Bible after the Reformation was because Protestantism puts a lot of emphasis, certainly in the United States, I know the founding fathers refer to the Old Testament as part of their heritage.
Right. Thank you for that comment, and I didn't emphasize it enough. So the English, and I'm going to use that word obsessed again, are obsessed with the Old Testament because of the Protestant Reformation and its, interestingly, Latin motto, sola scriptura, that is to say, by scripture only, as opposed to the Roman Catholic Church, which doesn't put a lot of focus on the Bible, but rather on the traditions of the church. So the whole Protestant Reformation was based on breaking with that and going back to biblical roots. That said, the Reformation actually begins in Germany and spreads to the Netherlands and then to England. So I must say that although there are wonderful scholars in Germany and the Netherlands throughout this entire time period who were studying the material, and there are still good manuscript collections in both countries, they didn't study it and didn't do it to the extent that the English did. There was just something about the way the English approached it. Part of it could be due to the wonder of the King James Bible, which was translated in 1611, which everybody read. The Germans were reading Luther's translation, and the Dutch were reading the Dutch translation. I don't have a ready, I mean, what you said is spot on, and it's absolutely correct, and it's certainly part of the picture, but then how come the other major countries in Northern Europe, Protestant, weren't doing the same thing? I don't have a ready answer for that. There is so much more in England, Cairo-Ghanese material aside, than there is in any of the major European libraries. Not even a close second. Yeah.
Just a personal an anecdote. At the Jewish Theological Seminary, in my beginning was for a part of a summer in 1967. And it's right after, in the tower where they stored this, there was a fire.
There was a fire.
And I came after that, but the fire department, and spraying everything to put out the fire, everything was completely soaked and drenched. So what they did is they set up in the so-called quadrangle temporary shelters, and on tables they had all of these manuscripts and everything to dry out and to deal with it. So that's why they created exactly what you
Yeah, thank you for that anecdote. And today you would not know that these things have been damaged at one point. I don't think they were all damaged, but certainly a number of them were. And I just have to do a shout out to the library conservators. These people who conserve manuscripts, and I've met people at the Library of Congress and JTS and so on, and Oxford who do this work. I call them alchemists. I mean, they can do anything with the ink, with the parchment. They can iron it out. I mean, this is like, don't try this at home with your iron. And you wouldn't know that anything had, it's just remarkable what they're able to do. So thank you to those great select individuals who do that work.
Why was the Domenico Solitano first read the Jerusalem one?
Like many, I believe, I don't know the full story on him, but if you notice the censor, many of them were converted Jews who could read the Hebrew and approve the text on behalf of the papal authorities. So I assume that that's most likely who he was and why he was called the Jerusalemite. The book on censorship is long in coming by Piet van Boxel, retired librarian, Cesar's predecessor at the Bodleian, who in his retirement has been working on the work that will really change our understanding of who the censors were and what they did and how they did it. I also can tell you, by the way, that the ink of these medieval manuscripts is so remarkable, quality of production, which I think I showed you, that when you see, for example, in a Talmud manuscript, I can show you, Andy, where the censor has blacked out stuff, 400 or 500 years later, that ink has disappeared. And you can actually read the Hebrew text underneath because the Hebrew ink was much better. The original ink was much better than what the cheaper ink the censor was using. It hasn't totally disappeared, but it's now that you can actually read the undertext. And the blackout is
Very, very interesting.
Well, on that note of the enduring power of Hebrew language, Hebrew scholarship, I'll just leave you with one anecdote of my own, which I was reminded of about Schechter sending these hundreds of thousands of manuscripts off by themselves. He was what you call an absent-minded professor, and he was once having guests for dinner, so he went up to change to receive his guests in proper Victorian attire. He took his clothes, got into bed, and went to sleep. His wife had to wake him up to remind him the guests would come. I want to thank Professor Rendsburg very much indeed for a really fascinating and illuminating presentation. And thanks everyone for coming and for coming to the series hitherto. Professor Rendsburg is also speaking at the Great Synagogue on the last day of Pesach, between the service and Kiddush. So you have another chance to hear him there as well.
Thank you very much.